Contractually obligated. What's up, guys? My name's Mark, and this is a look at 3 different Cyberpunk role playing games, all powered by the Apocalypse or the Apocalypse engine. Uh, the one found in such games as Apocalypse World or Dungeon World, or these 3 games here. The reason I wanted to talk about these 3 games in particular is because I think it's very interesting how they each approach Cyberpunk in a different way, which is something you didn't necessarily get back in the bad old days of role-playing. No, back when, Cyberpunk first became a thing in role-playing. So, of course, the first thing we've got to discuss when talking about Cyberpunk is, what is Cyberpunk? Oh God, I'm not going to answer that. We're going to be here all day if I get into that. It's a 30-year-old genre with so much scholarly work written about it already, much of which I've read because I've written papers on it in college. And yeah, it's just, we're not going to go there. It'll just be too much. So instead, let's focus on, what is Cyberpunk role-playing? So, from the very beginning, Cyberpunk role-playing, your big differentiator was rules complexity. How well were they emulating the genre wasn't so much of a concern as it was as, how do these guns work? How do these rules work? Obviously, Shadowrun, themed it slightly differently with some fantasy aspects, and that has proven to outlast regular Cyberpunk, which is a little odd to me, but whatever. But in general, you were looking at, how complex was your rule engine. Now, later on, we did start getting into some sub-themes of Cyberpunk, doing some individual stories, some of the more individual ideas that have shown in Cyberpunk instead of just that mission-based structure that Cyberpunk 2020 and Shadowrun always sort of went for. But it was still rules complexity. Sort of still ruled the day. Haha. But now we've got the Apocalypse engine, which is a little bit more fictionally based. And so there's some new games that fictionally work on Cyberpunk in slightly different ways. So the first game we're going to talk about is the Sprawl. It is mission based. And what I mean by that is it is very much based on what you would do in your old school Cyberpunk games. You will infiltrate a corporate facility. You will shoot some guards. You will steal some shit. You will hopefully escape from the said facility. And then you will be betrayed by the person who hired you. To reinforce that theme, a lot of the playbooks go along with that. We've got drivers, fixers, hackers, hunters, etc. We've even got the rocker boy type. It's called a pusher in the Sprawl, but it's very much still that same archetype. So you can definitely see which direction of the Cyberpunk role-playing game the Sprawl went for. And it also has a reporter playbook because it's apparently still the 80s. And we think journalism still exists, I guess. It also includes a complete Matrix subsystem with its own cheat. It's a whole bunch of Matrix moves, etc., etc. So it's really going for emulating the types of stories that you would tell with old Cyberpunk role-playing games. The way it does this is pretty cool, and it's a lot better than it used to be in the old days. We've got specific mechanics that deal with this. We've got some pacing mechanics to really move it along, because if you've ever played a Cyberpunk role-playing game, you know exactly what happens. You plan for 5 hours. You finally go on the mission. The first thing that happens screws up your entire plan, and you just ended up shooting your way out. So this game works on eliminating the planning, getting it down to a manageable level of planning, getting right into the action, and telling the cool parts of the story, not the boring parts. So to do that, it's got a couple different things. The first one's XP triggers. So you'll get XP when you decide on who your target is. You will get XP when you decide how to approach that target, etc., etc. It's sort of broken down by mission, and you just sort of pick those things. But that rewards players for getting to those planning points, to making the thing they want to have happen, and they'll get rewarded for it. So that helps. The second thing it's got two different phases of the game. It's got legwork and action. Legwork is, of course, the part where you go and investigate, figure out your sort of plan, how you can get in, all that sort of stuff. And then you go into the action phase, which is the actual infiltration mission. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it also deals with threat clocks. Each corporation has its own clock. And, as you make runs against the different corporations, they will, of course, increase their hatred of you, I guess. And the higher those clocks get, the more they're gunning for you. And, of course, that will drive story as well. To go into a little bit more detail on legwork and action. So legwork, of course, prepares you for the job ahead. It tells you who your target is, how you can get in, all that sort of stuff. The higher the legwork clock reaches, though, the higher the action clock starts. And when the action clock hits the end point, then the mission's over. You have failed. All the guards show up. The police show up. Whatever happens, you've failed. So that encourages you to not do as much legwork as you would think that you would want to. Legwork sets up a lot of the future actions, giving you bonuses in the action phase. But of course, the higher it goes, the higher the action clock starts. And the lower that legwork clock is, the better your payout at the end. So it does sort of encourage you to move through that boring planning phase and get right into the action, which is pretty cool. There are some downsides, of course. I'm not going to say these are negatives. These are some things to think about. There is that artificiality and structure that comes from that breakdown. Particularly, at least the way I run, it tends to be, a lot of missions to start with, and then the players, gain their own goals, their own agendas, their own drives, and then they start driving the story. They want to go raid this facility. They want to do this particular thing, and that doesn't necessarily fit within the structure of the Sprawl. You could find yourself getting less XP all of a sudden just because you're not following those XP triggers because you're off on your own beliefs and agendas and things, and that can screw it up. So it's just something to be aware of, which is why I wrote down, that difficulty in breaking that structure. It can be a little difficult in going off of that way of thinking. The game sort of discourages that. And also the Matrix moves. Wasn't a fan. The problem is it turns the Matrix into its own subsystem, which has always been the problem with Cyberpunk role-playing games and the Matrix. Yes, it is Apocalypse Engine, so those moves are a lot more fluid. They make a lot more, narrative sense. They're not that complicated, but just the fact that the Sprawl decided to do it that way does make it its own little separate mini game of a type that people need to keep track of. Wasn't a fan of that back in the 80s. Still not a fan of that now. So The Veil. The Veil is the next game we're going to talk about. It is also a Cyberpunk role-playing game. It is also powered by the Apocalypse, and it is a little bit more literary based. Now, I don't mean that in some highfalutin way of, literary is better than mission based. I don't mean it that way. What I mean is it's based more on the types of stories that you would see in cyberpunk fiction, cyberpunk movies, that sort of thing. A lot of those, of course, are mission based, but not all of them. And so this is where this game sort of approaches it. It's got a lot of weird playbooks like the Apparatus or the Catabolist? I don't know. The Onomastic, etc. Each of these is very, very fictionally positioned. For instance, the Apparatus is all about having a robot buddy. And what does that mean in the fiction? This robot buddy has a hunger. It has a desire and wants. And they don't necessarily go along with yours. And are you going to feed it and let it be super cool and awesome for you? Or are you going to tell it no because what it wants is bad? They're all like that. All the different playbooks, bring in different elements of cyberpunk. Some of them are specifically creating certain cyberpunk stories, and others are a little bit more general. It just sort of depends. And it uses a feeling wheel, which the least cyberpunk term in this entire video. Feeling wheel. The feeling wheel actually works. These are your attributes in the Veil. They are emotional states, and it's how your character reacts to the world. It's how you do things. Are you shooting this guy because you're mad at him or because you're scared? Either way. So basically, when you're making a move in the Veil, you're actually going to choose an emotional state that is triggering it, that is powering that move. And then, of course, you'll roll that state, and do the move as normal. But you also mark a little emotion spike, and those are those little boxes at the bottom of each of the little attributes. And when those are full, you're locked into that emotion. You're stuck that way. And the only way to get rid of that is to do an alleviate move, which changes up some things. And that big, circular chart there just sort of gives you some other emotional things to trigger. So you can tell it's a lot more based on the emotional life of your character than some other things. Downsides to the Veil, it's got some really esoteric playbooks. Some of them are bizarre. Some of them are so bizarre that I'm not even sure what cyberpunk fiction they're based on. I'm just like, I've never read a story about that particular thing. I don't know what's going on. And some playbooks will impact the fiction more than others. For instance, the corporate playbook, which, by the way, the Veil is the only of these 3 games that actually has a corporate playbook, allows you to play the corporations if you like. Food for thought. But like the corporate and I think the honor bound also, they are specifically tied to organizations, and so they can definitely sort of not take over the story, but have a bigger impact on the story than some others. The onomastic is another one where there's this whole organization in your past that's hunting you, and I'm just kind of like, where does that come from? How was that going to impact the guy who just wanted to play with a robot buddy? Yeah. And some moves could be worded a little better, I felt. Not that any of them is necessarily bad. I think most of the basic moves are pretty good. Pierce the Veil has a little bit of a confusing name based on what it actually does. But just some of the individual playbook moves, I just need to see them in play, I think, before I really, commit to that one. But those are some of the downsides to that one. Next one, Headspace. Shared consciousness cyberpunk. This is telling a very specific story. It's not like the others where it's just doing a generic cyberpunk sort of thing. No, what it is doing is it is telling Sense8, the TV show you may or may not have watched. But it's doing it through a cyberpunk lens. And actually, I think that's pretty cool. Sense8 was a interesting concept for a TV show, and I think taking it into cyberpunk and just making it sort of a cyberware thing actually makes a lot of sense. Makes it pretty cool. It's got sort of those mission-based playbooks again. It's got Handler, Infiltrator, Ronin, etc. And it also advances the agendas of the corporations with project clocks in a similar way to the Sprawl. It's a little more detailed, actually, but in general, it's the same sort of concept. Headspace uses stress track or stress tracks to replicate that whole Sense8 thing. Basically, the way it breaks down is each of the playbooks has access to certain skills that they are intrinsic to them. If they want to use one of the other skills in the game, they need to use this Headspace thing. They need to enter the mind of the other person, extract their skill, and use it. So this is sort of based on emotions of, what has triggered the need for this other skill. And it also has a concept of sync, which is, you are in sync together. And when you do that, you have to reveal a regret, make a sacrifice for another's drive. It gets into a lot of character stuff and a lot of stuff that I think it implements that Sense8 idea of sharing memories and consciousness pretty well through this little system. But it's a little complicated. It requires, some tokens moving around on a board. and whatnot. And you know, it also has the negative feedback sort of thing where the GM can start causing emotional complications. Another interesting thing in Headspace is that each of the skills is tied to specific baggage of the character, and so when you know start borrowing other people's move, you start ending up with their baggage, and then yeah, a lot of fun, pretty cool. So the downsides to Headspace is it uses skills instead of moves, and that's not a bad thing. Lots of games use skills instead of moves. The thing is about this is because it uses skills instead of moves, it loses out on some of the moves terminology that people are familiar with from Apocalypse Engine games, and it loses out on some of that advice, some of the principles and things that Apocalypse World discusses, the Apocalypse Engine games as in general discuss. And so I don't see it as a negative. It's just that Headspace is not the first Apocalypse Engine game you should run. I think you should probably run some other games first to see some of the way that moves work in action, to read some of that verbiage that those other games have in there. That was my biggest thing about Headspace, was they seem to skip some of that stuff and make it not an advanced game, but definitely shouldn't be your first Apocalypse Engine game. The stress tracks can be a little complex if you remember that graphic from a slide ago. There's a lot of words on there, and there's a lot of explanation in the book, you know, about how the different states work and everything. I think it, you know, once you play a little bit, it'll all be second nature, but at the beginning, there's probably some talking and some explanations that need to occur for a group to really get into it and to really understand how that all works. But of course, that is the core of the game, so it's pretty important that everybody understands how that works. And last thing is the art. Not a fan of cartoons for Cyberpunk. I don't know. Just never really worked for me. So what about Cyberware? All these games have Cyberware. Don't worry about it. They all have Cyberware. They all use Cyberware a lot. Every single character type starts with Cyberware of some type in all these games. The Sprawl, in addition, like what the general, you know, violence move that it has, actually has like losing limbs as one of the options that you can choose, just because, you know, Cyberware is available and that's what it's for. None of these, you know, games are going to change how you think about equipment in Apocalypse Engine. They all use that, you know, similar tag system. It all works. Cyberware works. So, which one to play? Well, they're all good. This really wasn't meant to be a negative review. They're all good for what they're trying to do. So, do you want to recreate previous Cyberpunk RPGs? Do you want to do a mission after mission? You want to run some infiltration, shoot some guards, run away from the cops? Then you should choose the Sprawl, because it's pretty much aligned to that way of thinking. You want to tell some Cyberpunk stories? Do you want to get into some Ghost in the Shell, maybe? I don't know. You probably want the Veil. It's got a lot more of that emotional aspect, the inner lives of your characters, the inner turmoils of your characters, and how they all play out against those various playbooks that bring in different types of Cyberpunk stories. So if you're more interested in that, probably go with the Veil. Create that mythical Sense8 Season 3 that we're never going to get. You're going to want Headspace for that. Yeah, I mean, it does one specific story, and that story it does, I think it does well, but it's not as broad as the other Cyberpunk games. But I think it still qualifies as Cyberpunk. So yeah, those was 3 different Cyberpunk Apocalypse Engine games. If you like this video, please click the little like button, subscribe to the channel. If you want us to do any more of these, any of these other types of games, review-ish things, let us know. You can follow us on Twitter at Thaco Podcast, and you know what speaks louder than words? Money. Money. It's money. So you can go to our Patreon at Thaco and give us money, I guess, maybe, if you want. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.